My study partner would skip our sessions, then ask for my notes right before exams. "You're so much better at this," she'd say sweetly. So I started making fake study guides just for her. She failed the midterm while I got an A. The first time Kayla skipped our study session, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. "I'm so sorry," she texted 20 minutes after we were supposed to meet at the library. "Family emergency. Can you send me your notes from today?" Of course I could. We were study partners after all. That's what partners do. They help each other succeed. I'd spent 2 hours that afternoon going through our organic chemistry materials, creating detailed outlines and practice problems, but I figured family comes first. The second time I was slightly annoyed, but still understanding. "Migraine hit out of nowhere," she texted just as I was packing my bag to head to our study spot. "Can barely look at screens. Mind sharing your notes when you're done?" By the third time I started to see the pattern. Kayla would enthusiastically agree to meet, then cancel last minute with increasingly creative excuses. Car trouble. Suddenly called into work. Roommate drama that required immediate attention. But she always asked for my notes afterward. "You're so much better at this than me," she'd say with that sweet smile when she picked them up from my dorm the next day. "I don't know how you make everything so clear and organized." What Kayla didn't know was that I spent hours preparing for each study session. While she was out partying with her sorority sisters or binge-watching Netflix shows, I was in the library at 7 a.m., organizing materials, creating detailed outlines, and preparing practice questions. The clear notes she praised were the result of serious, methodical work. I'd arrive at the library when it opened, armed with multiple textbooks, highlighters, and color-coded notebooks. I'd spend the first hour reviewing the previous lecture's material, then move on to the new content we were supposed to cover together. I'd create concept maps showing how different reactions connected, write out step-by-step mechanisms, and develop practice problems that mirrored Professor Harrison's testing style. The worst part was watching other students struggle while Kayla sailed through with borrowed knowledge. During our biochemistry class, I watched my friend Nathan spend hours trying to understand enzyme kinetics, while Kayla confidently answered questions using concepts from my notes that she'd photographed without asking. Our organic chemistry class was notorious for being a pre-med killer. Professor Harrison's exams were legendary for their difficulty, and the class average was usually a C-. Students called it organic hell for good reason. You couldn't coast through on natural talent or charm. You had to put in the work, understand the mechanisms, and memorize hundreds of reactions. Professor Harrison was a tall, intimidating man in his 60s who'd been teaching organic chemistry for over 30 years. He had a reputation for being brilliant but merciless. His exams were famous for including obscure reactions that had only been mentioned briefly in lecture, and he delighted in creating problems that required you to apply multiple concepts simultaneously. "If you can't handle undergraduate organic chemistry," he'd say during his first lecture each semester, scanning the packed auditorium with steel-gray eyes, "you have no business applying to medical school. This class will separate the serious students from the dreamers." The first exam had been a wake-up call for most of us. The average score was 58%, and several students dropped the class immediately afterward. But Kayla had scored an 82% using my study materials, which only encouraged her to lean more heavily on my work. Kayla seemed to think she could outsmart the system by outsourcing that work to me. "I'm more of a visual learner," she'd explain when I suggested she try making her own concept maps. "Your notes just make more sense to me than anything I could create." "Maybe we could try different study methods," I'd suggest. "Flashcards or practice problems together?" "Oh, I tried that once and it was a disaster," she'd laugh. "I'm just not good at that kind of thing. You have such a gift for organizing information." It wasn't a gift. It was hours of work that she wasn't willing to put in. The pattern continued for weeks. Kayla would make plans, cancel them, then show up at my door with Starbucks and compliments, ready to collect my materials. She'd scan through my notes quickly, snap photos with her phone, and promise to really dive deep into studying them. "You're honestly saving my life," she'd say. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Meanwhile, I was falling behind on my other classes because I was spending so much time preparing materials for study sessions that never happened. I'd create comprehensive guides expecting to work through them together, then end up studying alone while she went to mixers and formal dinners. My roommate Tessa started noticing the pattern too. "Why are you making study guides for someone who never shows up?" she asked one evening as I worked on yet another set of detailed notes for Kayla. "She's my study partner. Partners help each other. Partners show up," Tessa pointed out. "When's the last time she actually studied with you?" I couldn't remember. It had been weeks since we'd had an actual study session together. "Maybe you should talk to her about this," Tessa suggested. But every time I considered bringing it up, Kayla would show up with coffee and apologies, making me feel guilty for even thinking about confronting her. She had a way of making her excuses sound so reasonable, her gratitude so genuine. It got worse when I realized she was using my notes for other classes too. My roommate Tessa saw her photocopying my biochemistry outlines at the library one afternoon. "Isn't that your handwriting?" Tessa asked, pointing at the papers Kayla was feeding through the copy machine. I looked closer and recognized my detailed notes on enzyme kinetics and metabolic pathways. Notes I'd spent an entire Sunday creating for my biochemistry class, complete with diagrams and practice calculations. When did you give her those? Tessa pressed. I didn't, I said slowly, watching Kayla finish copying and slip the papers into her designer backpack without noticing us watching. That's when I understood the full scope of Kayla's academic strategy. She wasn't just avoiding work in one class. She was systematically freeloading across multiple subjects. I started paying closer attention and realized she'd been photographing my notes whenever she came to pick up the organic chemistry materials. While I thought she was just being thorough about studying, she was actually building a library of my work across different courses. I also noticed that she never seemed stressed about deadlines or exams the way the rest of us pre-med students did. While we were pulling all-nighters and surviving on coffee and energy drinks, Kayla maintained her perfect appearance and social schedule. Now I knew why. She was outsourcing all the hard work to people like me. The discovery led me to investigate further. I asked around discreetly and learned that Kayla had similar arrangements with at least 3 other students. She was getting physics notes from Brandon, calculus homework help from Priya, and biology lab reports from Marcus. She'd created an entire network of academic support that required no effort from her whatsoever. She told me she was struggling with time management because of her sorority commitments. Brandon explained when I casually brought up the subject. I felt bad for her, so I started sharing my physics notes. Same here, said Priya. She said she was working part-time to help pay for school, so I didn't mind helping with calculus. None of us had realized we were being played. Kayla had crafted different sob stories for each of us, designed to exploit our sympathies and willingness to help a struggling classmate. The breaking point came when she skipped our final review session before the midterm, our most important study date yet. I'd spent the entire weekend preparing comprehensive materials covering everything Professor Harrison had emphasized in his review lecture. I'd organized the content by reaction type, created mnemonic devices for remembering mechanisms, and developed practice problems that incorporated multiple concepts. Can't make it tonight, she texted at 5 p.m., 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet. Blake's having people over and I promised I'd be there. You understand, right? Can you just send me whatever you covered? Blake Morrison, the guy from her marketing class who threw legendary parties in his off-campus house. She was choosing a party over studying for an exam that would determine 30% of our semester grade. I stared at the text message, feeling something shift inside me. While I'd been sacrificing my entire weekend to prepare materials for both of us, she'd been planning her social calendar around parties and hookups. That's when I decided it was time for Kayla to learn about consequences. I spent that evening creating 2 sets of study materials. The real ones, which contained accurate reaction mechanisms, correct nomenclature rules, and proper stereochemistry concepts. Everything I knew would be on Professor Harrison's exam based on his patterns from previous tests. And then I created special ones, just for Kayla. The fake study guides looked legitimate at first glance. Same formatting, same neat handwriting, same confident tone, but the content was subtly, carefully wrong. I switched the positions of functional groups in key reactions. I accidentally mislabeled stereoisomers. I created practice problems with incorrect answers presented as correct ones. The genius was in the details. I made sure the errors weren't obvious. They were the kind of mistakes that would only be caught by someone who actually understood the underlying chemistry. Someone memorizing without comprehension would accept them as fact. For example, in a nucleophilic substitution reaction, I drew the mechanism with the nucleophile attacking from the wrong side, leading to the wrong stereochemical outcome. To someone who understood the concept, this would be glaringly wrong. But to someone just memorizing the steps, it would look fine. I created an entire section on carbonyl chemistry, where I systematically reversed the reactivity patterns of aldehydes and ketones. I wrote practice problems about NMR spectroscopy, where I assigned incorrect chemical shifts to different functional groups. I even included a section on synthesis where every retrosynthetic pathway I suggested would actually lead to the wrong product. The most devious part was the nomenclature section. I created a comprehensive guide to IUPAC naming that looked authoritative but contained systematic error. I switched the priority rules for functional groups, gave incorrect names to common molecules, and created practice problems where every correct answer was actually wrong. The hardest part was making the mistakes look like honest errors rather than deliberate sabotage. I had to think like someone who was genuinely confused about the material, not someone trying to mislead a freeloader. You're such a lifesaver, Kayla said when she picked up the fake guides the next morning, clutching her usual peace-offering coffee. I don't know what I'd do without you. I was at Blake's until like 2 a.m., so I really need to cram today. Just make sure you really understand the mechanisms, I said sweetly. Don't just memorize them. Oh, totally, she nodded, already scrolling through her phone. You explained everything so clearly, though. I'm sure I'll be fine. She didn't even look at the materials properly before stuffing them into her designer backpack. If she had, she might have noticed that some of the chemical structures looked off, that some of the reaction arrows pointed in impossible directions. The next 2 days were fascinating to watch. I saw Kayla in the library, diligently highlighting my fake notes and creating flashcards based on incorrect information. She looked so confident, so prepared. She even helped a struggling classmate with one of the wrong mechanisms I'd included, spreading the misinformation further. 3 days later, we sat for the midterm in the large lecture hall. The atmosphere was tense, with 200 pre-med students fidgeting nervously as Professor Harrison distributed the exam booklets. I used my real notes and felt confident about most of the questions. The reaction mechanisms flowed logically, the nomenclature made sense, and the stereochemistry problems felt manageable. Kayla, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, looked increasingly confused as the exam progressed. I watched her flip back and forth through her answer sheets, erase answers multiple times, and check her watch with growing panic. By the end of the 2-hour period, she looked absolutely defeated. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The exam covered exactly what I'd expected. Professor Harrison tested the same types of reactions I'd studied, used similar problem formats to what I'd practiced, and emphasized the same concepts he always did. My real study guides had prepared me perfectly. Kayla's fake guides, on the other hand, had led her into every possible trap. Every wrong mechanism she'd memorized, every incorrect reactivity pattern she'd learned, every backwards stereochemical outcome she'd practiced, all of it was tested on this exam. When grades were posted a week later on the class portal, I had an A-. Kayla had failed with a 42%. "I don't understand," she said, cornering me after our next class with tears in her eyes. "I studied your notes for hours. I memorized everything. How did I fail when you got an A?" I put on my most sympathetic expression. "That's so strange. Are you sure you understood all the concepts? Maybe you were just nervous during the exam? But I used your study guides exactly like always. They've never failed me before." "Maybe Professor Harrison changed his testing style," I suggested. "These organic chemistry exams can be really tricky." Over the next few days, I watched Kayla spiral. She met with Professor Harrison during office hours, convinced there had been a grading error. She brought her exam to multiple teaching assistants, insisting that her answers were correct. She joined study groups with other students, desperately trying to figure out where she'd gone wrong. "I don't understand what happened," she told our mutual friend Emma during lunch. "I studied so hard for this exam. I used the same study methods that have always worked for me." Emma looked uncomfortable. "Maybe you should try forming a real study group, like actually working through problems together instead of just reading notes." "I do study with people," Kayla protested. "I have a study partner." "Do you mean that girl who always makes the notes for you?" Emma asked carefully. "Because that's not really studying together." The conversation made me realize that other people had noticed Kayla's pattern too. She'd been taking advantage of multiple students, not just me. What made it worse was watching her try to blame everyone except herself. She complained that Professor Harrison was unfair, that the exam was too hard, that the teaching assistants had given her wrong information during review sessions. She never once considered that the problem might be her own lack of understanding. What Kayla didn't realize was that her fundamental understanding of the material was completely wrong, thanks to months of relying on my work instead of developing her own knowledge base. The fake study guides had simply exposed the weakness that was already there. "I think I need to drop the class," she told me 2 weeks later, looking exhausted and defeated. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect appearance had started to slip. "I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong." "Maybe that's for the best," I said gently. "You can always retake it next semester when you have more time to focus." The irony wasn't lost on me. By the time she retook the class, she'd actually have to do the work herself. But the story doesn't end there. Word traveled fast in our pre-med program about Kayla's spectacular failure. Other students who'd been enabling similar relationships started questioning their own study partnerships. Some of my classmates approached me privately, asking if I'd noticed anything odd about Kayla's study habits. "She always seemed so confident," said Marcus, who'd been in our study group earlier in the semester. "But now that I think about it, she never contributed anything original to our discussions." "I lent her my notes for the first exam," added Priya. "She got a B+ and kept asking to borrow them again. I thought she was just being efficient." "Efficient at what?" asked Jenna, another pre-med student, taking advantage of people who actually do the work. The revelation led to a broader conversation among our pre-med classmates about academic integrity and mutual support versus enabling. Several students admitted they'd been in similar situations, providing notes and homework help to people who never reciprocated. The pre-med community was small and competitive. Students talked, professors noticed patterns. Kayla's reputation shifted from smart and social to freeloader who got caught. I also learned that Professor Harrison had suspected something was wrong with Kayla's academic performance for weeks. Her homework assignments were always perfect, but her in-class quiz scores were terrible. When students' homework and exam performance don't match, it usually indicates academic dishonesty. "I've seen this pattern before," Professor Harrison told me when I visited his office hours. "Students who rely too heavily on outside help develop a false sense of confidence. When they're forced to demonstrate actual understanding, the house of cards collapses." "How did you know?" I asked. 30 years of teaching, you develop an instinct for these things. The student who turns in perfect homework but can't answer basic questions in class. The student who seems confident until they're asked to explain their reasoning. Academic dishonesty leaves signatures. Meanwhile, my own academic performance improved dramatically. Without spending hours creating study materials for someone else, I had time to focus on my other classes. My GPA jumped from a 3.6 to a 3.8, my MCAT prep time increased, and I felt more confident about my medical school applications. I also started forming genuine study partnerships with other students who actually contributed to our sessions. Working with people like Marcus and Priya, who brought their own insights and prepared their own materials, made studying more effective and enjoyable. The difference was night and day. Instead of spending hours preparing materials that would be passively consumed, I was engaging in active discussions about concepts, working through problems collaboratively, and learning from my partner's perspectives. But the real lesson came during our final exam preparation. This time, Kayla actually studied. She formed a genuine study group with other struggling students, spent long hours in the library, and created her own notes and practice problems. She asked thoughtful questions during review sessions and sought help from teaching assistants when she didn't understand concepts. I watched this transformation with fascination. The Kayla who showed up to study groups now was different, more engaged, more humble, actually contributing to discussions instead of just absorbing other people's work. I never realized how much I was missing, she told our study group one evening. When you actually understand the material instead of just memorizing someone else's interpretation, it makes so much more sense. The change in her approach was remarkable. She started asking why questions instead of just what questions. She wanted to understand the underlying principles behind reactions, not just memorize the steps. She practiced problems until she could solve them without referring to notes. She earned a C+ on the final, not spectacular, but a solid improvement that reflected actual learning and understanding. More importantly, she developed real study skills that would serve her in future classes. I figured out what went wrong, she told me after grades were posted. Her voice different than before, more mature, less entitled. I was relying too much on other people's work instead of learning the material myself. That's really insightful, I said, meaning it. I'm retaking the class next semester, she continued, but this time I'm going to do it right. Actually study, actually learn the material, actually contribute to study groups instead of just taking from them. That sounds like a good plan. I also want to apologize, she said, looking directly at me for the first time in weeks. I realize now that I was taking advantage of your kindness. You spent so much time helping me and I never gave anything back. That wasn't fair to you. Her apology caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, accusations, maybe even tears. But this mature acknowledgement of her behavior was something I hadn't anticipated. I appreciate that, I said carefully. I know you probably don't want to study together anymore, and I understand, but I hope we can still be friends. The conversation made me realize that the fake study guides had accomplished something I hadn't expected. They'd forced Kayla to confront her own academic habits and develop real learning skills. Looking back, I don't regret creating those fake study guides. Kayla needed to learn that academic success requires personal effort, not clever manipulation of other people's work. The pre-med track is incredibly demanding, and students who can't handle undergraduate chemistry certainly can't handle medical school. But I also learned something important about setting boundaries. Instead of enabling Kayla's behavior for months, I should have addressed the pattern directly. I should have told her that our study partnership wasn't working and that she needed to develop her own study skills. The fake notes were effective, but they were also passive-aggressive. A more mature approach would have been honest communication about expectations and mutual effort in academic partnerships. However, sometimes people need to face natural consequences before they're willing to change their behavior. Kayla had been getting away with academic freeloading for months, probably years. My direct approach might not have been as effective as the wake-up call of actual failure. The semester continued, and I watched Kayla's transformation with interest. She started attending Professor Harrison's office hours regularly, asking genuine questions about concepts she didn't understand. She formed study groups where she actually contributed, bringing her own notes and practice problems to share. She's like a different person, Tessa observed one evening as we watched Kayla explaining reaction mechanisms to a struggling classmate in the library. Actually helpful instead of just taking from everyone. By the end of the semester, Kayla had earned respect from our classmates through her genuine efforts to learn and contribute. Her final grade was a C, which wasn't great, but it represented real understanding rather than borrowed knowledge. The experience also changed how I approached academic partnerships. I became more selective about who I studied with, making sure there was mutual benefit and contribution. I learned to recognize the warning signs of freeloaders and set clear expectations from the beginning. 3 years later, I'm in my first year of medical school, and the lessons from that organic chemistry class serve me well. I'm careful about study partnerships, making sure they're truly mutual. I help classmates who are struggling, but I don't enable laziness or academic dishonesty. Medical school is incredibly demanding, and there's no room for freeloaders who expect others to do their work for them. The patients we'll eventually treat deserve doctors who've actually learned the material, not ones who've coasted through on other people's efforts. The workload in medical school makes undergraduate chemistry look like child's play. We're expected to master massive amounts of information in short periods, and there's no way to fake understanding when you're tested on clinical applications. The students who succeed are the ones who've learned how to study effectively, not the ones who've relied on others to do their thinking for them. As for Kayla, she ended up changing her major to communications and seemed much happier once she found a field that matched her actual interests and work style. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable ones. She also became genuinely successful in her new field, partly because she'd learned the importance of putting in real effort. The work ethic she developed during her struggle with organic chemistry served her well in her communications courses and internships. We stayed in touch occasionally, and she often credited that failed midterm as a turning point in her academic life. It was the first time I couldn't charm or manipulate my way to success, she told me during our senior year. I had to actually learn how to work. Her transformation was complete by graduation. She'd become someone who contributed to group projects instead of coasting on others' efforts. She developed genuine expertise in her field through hard work and dedication. Most importantly, she'd learned to value knowledge for its own sake, not just as a means to an end. The experience taught me that there's a difference between helping someone learn and doing their work for them. Real partnership requires mutual effort, respect, and contribution from both sides. When someone consistently takes without giving back, they're not really a partner, they're just using you. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the natural consequences of their choices. Kayla needed to fail that midterm to understand that success requires effort. My fake study guides didn't cause her failure. Her lack of preparation and understanding did. I just stopped enabling her avoidance of responsibility. The broader lesson applies beyond academics too. In any relationship, professional, personal, or academic, there needs to be mutual respect and contribution. When one person consistently takes advantage of another's generosity without reciprocating, it's not really a partnership at all. Setting boundaries and expecting mutual effort isn't mean or selfish. It's necessary for healthy relationships and personal growth. Sometimes people need to face consequences before they're motivated to change problematic behavior patterns. In the end, we both learned valuable lessons about academic integrity, personal responsibility, and the importance of genuine effort in achieving our goals. And those lessons have served us both well in our respective paths since then. The fake study guides became a legendary story among our pre-med classmates, though I never confirmed or denied my role in Kayla's midterm disaster. Sometimes the most effective lessons are the ones people have to figure out for themselves. Looking back, I'm proud that I stood up for myself and refused to continue being taken advantage of. The passive-aggressive method might not have been perfect, but it was effective in teaching an important lesson about personal responsibility and academic integrity. Most importantly, both Kayla and I became better students and better people through the experience. She learned to value hard work and genuine effort, while I learned to set boundaries and expect mutual respect in academic partnerships. The story also influenced how other students in our program approached study relationships. Several classmates told me they'd become more careful about ensuring mutual contribution in their academic partnerships. The idea of study partners versus study charity cases became a running joke in our pre-med community. And isn't that what college is really about? Learning not just academic subjects, but life lessons about character, integrity, and personal responsibility? In that sense, the fake study guides were perhaps the most valuable educational tool either of us encountered that semester. The experience shaped my approach to relationships in general. I learned to recognize when someone is taking advantage of my generosity, and I'm not afraid to set boundaries when necessary. These skills have been invaluable in medical school, where collaborative learning is essential, but everyone must contribute their fair share. Years later, when I tell this story to struggling medical students, I always emphasize that the real lesson isn't about revenge or getting back at people who take advantage of you. It's about understanding that enabling someone's bad behavior doesn't actually help them. It prevents them from developing the skills they need to succeed on their own. Sometimes being a good friend means refusing to make things easy for someone who needs to learn how to work hard. And sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the opportunity to fail and learn from their mistakes.